At 10:52 hours on the morning of June 21st, 1919, the German battleship Friedrich der Große began to list to port. She listed slowly at first, then with increasing speed as the water flooding through her deliberately opened seacocks, and through the holes cut in her water pipes and condensers reached the volumes that made recovery impossible. Her crew had already taken to the lifeboats. Her officers had already transmitted the signal that was passing from ship to ship across the sheltered water of Scapa Flow, the signal that Rear Admiral Ludwig von Reuter had prepared for precisely this moment. Paragraph 11. Acknowledge. Paragraph 11 meant scuttle the ship. Within minutes of the Friedrich der Große beginning her list, other German warships in the anchorage were following her down. The battleship Kaiserin opened her seacocks and her engine room flooding valves simultaneously, and her rate of flooding was so rapid that she was on her side within the hour. The battlecruiser Seydlitz, which had been the most heavily damaged major warship to survive Jutland 3 years earlier, taking 21 heavy shell hits and 5 torpedo hits before limping home, now settled quietly into the harbour mud without any enemy shell finding her. The battleship Bayern, which had never fully worked up before the armistice ended the war she had been built to fight, went down with her turrets still trained fore and aft, untouched by any weapon but the deliberate actions of her own engineer officers. By afternoon, 52 of the 74 German warships interned at Scapa Flow had gone to the bottom. It was the largest single loss of warships in one day in the history of naval warfare. The ships had not been attacked. They had not been caught in a storm or a fire or an explosion. They had been sunk by their own crews in the most orderly anchorage in the world in broad daylight, while British naval officers watched in disbelief from the shore and from the decks of their own vessels. The British had been outwitted in a way they had not anticipated was possible, and the humiliation of it expressed itself almost immediately in violence. 9 German sailors were shot dead by British guards in the confusion that followed the scuttling. Several more were wounded. They were the last casualties of the First World War in the Western Theatre. The scuttling at Scapa Flow was not an impulsive act. It was the culmination of 7 months of careful preparation by a man who had concluded, with a correctness that the historical record fully supports, that what was about to happen to his ships was worse than sinking them. To understand why von Reuter gave the order, and why his officers followed it with such speed and such completeness, it is necessary to understand what the German high seas fleet had been, what had happened to it between November of 1918 and June of 1919, and what was at stake in the negotiations that were, on June 21st, 1919, approaching their crisis point in Paris. The German high seas fleet at the armistice of November 11th, 1918, was not a defeated fleet in the conventional military sense. It had fought one major engagement with the British Grand Fleet, the Battle of Jutland in May and June of 1916, and had inflicted heavier losses on the British than it had suffered itself before returning to port. It had never subsequently been drawn into another decisive engagement. It was, in November of 1918, substantially intact, its major units largely undamaged by enemy action, its magazines full, its crews present if mutinous. It had not been broken by combat. It had been rendered irrelevant by the collapse of the German war effort on land, and it had found its relevance at the end not in fighting the enemy, but in the mutinies that swept through its crews in late October and early November of 1918 and contributed to the social revolution that toppled the Kaiser and ended the war. The armistice terms required the internment of the German fleet's most powerful units. The specific list was substantial: 10 battleships, 6 battlecruisers, 8 light cruisers, and 50 destroyers. These ships were to proceed under their own power to an Allied port designated by the Supreme Allied Commander, there to be interned pending the final peace settlement that would determine their ultimate disposition. The internment was specifically distinguished from surrender. The ships remained under German colours, with German crews flying the German naval ensign. Their eventual fate would be decided by the peace conference, which was expected to conclude relatively quickly, and which would presumably resolve the question of whether the ships would be returned to Germany, divided among the Allied powers, or destroyed. The voyage of the interned fleet to Scapa Flow on November 21, 1918, was one of the more remarkable spectacles of the entire war. 157 Allied warships met the German fleet in the Firth of Forth, surrounding it in two parallel lines through which the German ships steamed in a formation that was, in its external appearance, orderly and professional. The British Grand Fleet, which had spent 4 years waiting for the decisive fleet action that never fully materialized, was now escorting the enemy fleet to captivity without a shot being fired. Admiral Sir David Beatty, commanding the Grand Fleet, issued an order to his ships that they were not to cheer as the Germans passed, which was a form of dignity extended to the defeated that Beatty regarded as appropriate to the occasion and that reflected his understanding that the moment was too grave for triumphalism. Scapa Flow was chosen as the internment location for reasons of security and practicality. The anchorage was remote, well protected from any external threat, and large enough to accommodate the entire German fleet with room to spare. The British could monitor the interned ships from the shore installations and from patrol vessels without the Germans being in a position to interact with the civilian population or to receive outside assistance. It was, in the assessment of those who selected it, the ideal location for keeping a large fleet of warships in limbo, while the diplomats in Paris worked out what to do with them. The limbo was more extended and more psychologically corrosive than anyone had anticipated. The German crews, who had been told that the internment would be temporary and that the peace conference would resolve their status within weeks, found themselves sitting in Scapa Flow through the winter of 1918-19, through the spring of 1919, and into the summer, with no clear indication of when or how the matter would be settled. The conditions of internment were restrictive. The German ships were not allowed to coal fully, which meant they had limited power for heating in the harsh Orkney winter. Mail from Germany arrived irregularly. Shore leave was not permitted. The crews, confined to their ships for months on end, in cold and damp conditions, with inadequate supplies and deteriorating morale, were in a condition that the British naval officers who monitored them recognized as deeply unhealthy. The German crews shrank as the months passed. Men who had been on the ships at the armistice were gradually reduced in number as men were repatriated for various reasons, and the replacement crews sent from Germany were smaller than the original complements. By the spring of 1919, the German ships were being maintained by skeleton crews, men whose primary function was to keep the ships from becoming hazardous rather than to keep them operationally ready. Maintenance suffered. Equipment deteriorated. The physical condition of ships that had been kept in a state of careful preservation for 4 years of wartime service was declining noticeably after 7 months of restricted internment. Von Reuter, who was responsible for the interned fleet, was watching this deterioration with a combination of professional concern and something that might be described as strategic awareness. He had been given command of the interned fleet because he was one of the senior officers available, not because there was any particular expectation that the job would require command decisions of significance. He had expected, as everyone had expected, that the peace conference would resolve the fleet's status quickly. As the months passed and the negotiations in Paris continued without resolution, he began to think carefully about the scenarios that might unfold. The scenario he considered most seriously was British seizure. Under the armistice terms, the interned ships remained German property. They were interned, not surrendered, and the distinction was legally and diplomatically significant. But the armistice was a temporary arrangement pending the final peace treaty, and if the negotiations in Paris collapsed, if the German government refused to sign whatever treaty the Allied powers produced, the armistice might be extended or might simply expire, at which point the status of the interned ships would become legally unclear, and the British, who physically controlled Scapa Flow, would be in a position to simply take them. Von Reuter was receiving information about the peace negotiations from German newspapers, which arrived intermittently and were usually several days old by the time they reached Scapa Flow. His information about the state of the negotiations was therefore incomplete and often outdated. He knew that the German government was under enormous pressure to sign the Treaty of Versailles, and he knew that the treaty's terms, which had been presented to the German delegation in May of 1919, included provisions regarding the German fleet that the German government found deeply objectionable. He did not know, and could not know with any precision, how close the negotiations were to their conclusion or what the German government was planning to do. What he did know was that the armistice was due to expire at noon on June 21st, 1919. If it expired without a new agreement, the legal framework that protected the interned ships from British seizure would disappear. He had read in the German newspapers, which arrived late, and which he could not fully trust, that the German government was being given a final deadline to sign the treaty, and that the deadline was approaching. He had also been given, through official channels, no information about what the British intended to do when the armistice expired. Von Reuter was a man of methodical temperament and careful judgment. He had been preparing for the possibility of scuttling since at least March of 1919, when it had become clear to him that the internment was going to be extended indefinitely and that the eventual outcome of the peace negotiations was uncertain. The preparation involved developing the specific technical procedures by which each ship's flooding systems could be opened simultaneously, briefing his officers on the plan and the signal that would initiate it, and ensuring that the German crews would have sufficient time to abandon their ships safely before the flooding reached critical stages. He had done this preparation quietly, without informing the British, which was the only way it could have been done. The morning of June 21st, 1919, began with the departure of most of the British naval vessels that normally guarded and patrolled around the interned fleet. The first battle squadron of the Grand Fleet, which had been stationed at Scapa Flow as the monitoring force, had taken advantage of a period of good weather to conduct exercises in the open sea, leaving only a small number of vessels in the anchorage. Von Reuter had observed this departure with interest. He had also received, that morning, news from the German newspapers that suggested the deadline for the German government to sign the treaty was June 21st, and that there was serious doubt about whether the government would comply. He could not verify this information. He could not reach the German government by any direct communication. He could not receive orders from Berlin because the armistice terms had severed his direct communication links. He made his decision. He gave the order. The signal paragraph 11. Acknowledge went from ship to ship through flag hoists, through officers in small boats, through prearranged visual signals. The German ships had been preparing for this moment for months. The response was rapid, coordinated, and on most ships entirely effective. Seacocks were opened. Engine room flooding valves were released. Pipes and condensers were deliberately broken. Portholes were opened below the waterline. In ship after ship, the careful engineering of the Imperial German Navy's fleet was turned against itself, the systems designed to keep water out being used to let it in. The British vessels remaining in the anchorage responded as quickly as they could, but quickly was not quickly enough. British boarding parties clambered over the sides of German ships and attempted to close the flooding valves and seacocks. In some cases they succeeded, and several ships were saved from sinking or were grounded in shallow water before they could go down fully. Most of the time they failed, because the German officers and crew members physically obstructed them, because the flooding had already reached levels that could not be reversed without pumping equipment that was not immediately available, or because the ships were already beyond saving by the time the boarding parties arrived. The shooting of the 9 German sailors occurred in the confusion of this phase of the operation. The British boarding parties were armed, and when German sailors resisted, or were perceived as resisting the efforts to save the ships, the British guards opened fire. The German sailors who were killed were, by all subsequent analysis, following legitimate orders from legitimate officers under the laws of naval warfare. They were acting within the framework of their duty as soldiers of a state that had not surrendered, in an action that their commanding officer had authorized. They were shot by British guards who were acting under orders of their own, in circumstances of confusion and anger that the scale and speed of the scuttling had generated. The 9 deaths were, in the most precise sense, the last combat casualties on the Western Front of the First World War. By the afternoon of June 21st, the visible evidence of what had happened was spread across the anchorage. The battleship Hindenburg, the most modern German capital ship at Scapa Flow, lay on her side with her funnels in the water. The battlecruiser Moltke had gone down so rapidly that her crew had barely had time to abandon ship. The battleship Markgraf, one of the veterans of Jutland, was on the bottom. The light cruisers and destroyers, smaller and with less freeboard than the capital ships, had in many cases simply disappeared, their hulls resting on the bottom of the anchorage with only the tips of their masts visible above the water. The British response was a mixture of fury and grudging acknowledgement that they had been outmaneuvered in a way that was, from the German perspective, entirely consistent with the laws of war. The Hague Conventions gave the commander of an interned fleet the right to sink his ships rather than allow them to be captured by an enemy. Von Reuter had exercised that right. He had done so, by his own account and by the account of most subsequent analysis, because he genuinely believed that the armistice had expired and that British seizure was imminent. Whether this belief was entirely accurate, whether the armistice had in fact expired at the moment he gave the order, has been the subject of historical debate. The balance of evidence suggests that von Reuter was acting on the best information available to him, that his interpretation of the situation was reasonable given that information, and that his decision was legally and morally defensible under the circumstances as he understood them. The Allied Supreme Council, meeting in Paris when the news arrived, was furious. The ships that had been sunk were the ones the Allied naval powers had been arguing over for months, each wanting a larger share of the German fleet as reparations for their wartime losses. The British had wanted some of them. The French had wanted some of them. The Italians and the Japanese and the Americans had all expressed various interests in the interned German ships. The scuttling eliminated the subject of these arguments entirely, and with a completeness that was almost theatrical in its efficiency. There was nothing left to divide. The German government, facing the demand for explanation, produced an explanation that was simultaneously accurate and politically convenient. The order had been given by an officer acting on his own judgment in a situation of genuine uncertainty, without instructions from the government in Berlin, in circumstances that made consultation impossible. This was essentially true. Von Reuter had not received orders from Berlin. He had acted on his own assessment of the situation. The government could honestly disclaim responsibility for the specific timing and execution of the scuttling, while the moral and military logic of the act was one that most Germans found entirely satisfactory. Von Reuter himself was interned as a prisoner of war following the scuttling, since the British determined that the act had taken place before the official signing of the peace treaty, and that he was therefore subject to treatment as a prisoner rather than as a civilian internee. He was held in Britain until January of 1920, when he was repatriated to Germany. He was received in Germany as a national hero, which he was, and awarded the highest decorations available from the new German government, which had replaced the imperial government that had built the fleet he had sunk. He lived until 1943, long enough to see a Second World War begin, to see Germany's second naval build-up, and to see the beginnings of that Second Fleet's losses to Allied action. He did not live to see the Second German Navy's end. The specific fate of the 52 ships that went down at Scapa Flow was not uniform and has extended well into the 21st century. The largest and most recently sunk, the capital ships, were in most cases lying in water shallow enough to make salvage commercially viable, if not straightforward. A Scottish salvage company, Metal Industries Limited, and before it the Scapa Flow Salvage Company, and the firm of Ernest Cox and Company undertook a systematic salvage program through the 1920s and 30s that was one of the most ambitious civilian engineering projects of the interwar period. Cox, who had no previous salvage experience when he purchased the rights to the wrecks in 1923, developed the techniques and acquired the equipment to raise ships of a size and complexity that had never previously been salvaged from the seabed. He raised the destroyers first, using compressed air injected into their flooded hulls to restore buoyancy. Then the larger cruisers, and eventually the capital ships. The work required the development of custom salvage vessels and the adaptation of existing equipment in ways that the conventional salvage industry of the period could not have anticipated. Cox brought up most of the major wrecks through a combination of compressed air, patching, and an extraordinary willingness to spend money and effort on problems that most professional salvors would have declined as impractical. The German steel that was extracted from the Scapa Flow wrecks was valuable, and it became more valuable as the 1930s progressed, and the demand for steel from the rearmament programs of multiple nations, Germany prominently among them, drove up prices. The irony that German battleship steel was being melted down and sold back into a European steel market that was simultaneously being used to build new warships was not lost on contemporary observers, though it was also not the kind of irony that affected the commercial calculations of the salvage companies involved. 3 German capital ships were never raised and remain on the seabed at Scapa Flow today. They are the battleships König, Markgraf, and Kronprinz Wilhelm, which sank in water deep enough that the salvage economics of the period never justified the effort to raise them. They are now, along with several of the surviving smaller wrecks, one of the most celebrated scuba diving destinations in the world. The wrecks have been protected under the Ancient Monuments and Archaeological Areas Act since 1981, which gives them a legal status as designated monuments and restricts any interference with them. They have been visited by many thousands of divers over the subsequent decades, who swim through the corroding compartments of warships that were built to fight a war they barely participated in and that were sunk by their own crews in the most theatrical non-engagement in naval history. The wrecks have also been the source of a specific and unexpected scientific application. The steel used to construct the German high seas fleet was smelted before the nuclear tests of the 1940s and 50s that distributed trace levels of radioactive isotopes through the entire global atmosphere. Steel manufactured after those tests contains these trace isotopes in amounts so small that they do not constitute a health hazard, but that are large enough to interfere with the most sensitive radiation detection instruments, which require a background of essentially zero radioactivity to function. The pre-nuclear German steel from Scapa Flow is therefore used in the construction of the most sensitive radiation detection equipment in the world, including instruments used in medical physics and in fundamental particle research. The battleships of the Kaiser's fleet have ended their material existence contributing to the detection of cancer in hospitals and to the investigation of the subatomic structure of matter in physics laboratories. The historical significance of the Scapa Flow scuttling has been interpreted differently by different parties over the century since it occurred. The British naval officers who watched it happen regarded it as an act of perfidy, a violation of the spirit, if not the letter of the armistice terms. The German naval officers and public regarded it as an act of honor, the preservation of national dignity, in a moment when the alternative was the division of the German fleet among the victors as war reparations. Academic historians have tended toward a more nuanced assessment that acknowledges the legal defensibility of von Reuter's decision, recognizes the genuine uncertainty under which he acted, and places the scuttling in the broader context of the peace negotiations and the political crisis they represented. What is not seriously in dispute is the consequence. The scuttling transformed the distribution of naval power in the post-war world. The German ships that the Allied powers had been planning to distribute among themselves as reparations were gone, and the compromise of Allied interests that their distribution would have required was unnecessary. Britain retained its numerical naval superiority without having to absorb into the Royal Navy a large number of German ships whose maintenance and integration would have created their own difficulties. France did not receive the German ships it had been demanding and was correspondingly aggrieved, a grievance that contributed to the tension between Britain and France over naval power that persisted through the 1920s. The United States, which had been arguing for the destruction of the German ships as the fairest resolution of the distribution problem, got, in effect, the outcome it had been advocating, though not through the mechanism it had proposed. The Washington Naval Treaty of 1922, which established the naval limitation agreements that governed the construction of capital ships through the 1930s, was negotiated in a context in which the German fleet no longer existed as a distributable asset and in which the naval power calculations of the major powers were therefore based on their own existing and projected construction rather than on German additions to any particular national fleet. The treaty's provisions were shaped by the specific naval balance that existed in the early 1920s, and that balance had been determined in part by the events of June 21, 1919. Von Reuter's decision in the 10 hours that separated the departure of the British 1st Battle Squadron and the arrival of British boarding parties on the German ships was therefore not merely a tactical decision about the fate of 52 warships. It was a decision that shaped the naval strategic landscape of the entire interwar period and contributed to the specific diplomatic environment in which the 1922 treaty was negotiated. The decision was made by one man, on his own authority, based on incomplete and partly inaccurate information, in a situation that his superiors had not anticipated and for which they had not prepared him with instructions. He made the decision that he believed was correct, and the physical and diplomatic consequences of that decision were still being worked through when the century turned. The König lies in 45 meters of water at Scapa Flow, on her side, her hull encrusted with a century of marine growth. The Markgraf lies at 52 meters, deeper and less visited than her sister ships, her interior dark and silt-covered. The Kronprinz Wilhelm is in the shallowest position of the 3 remaining capital ships, at 29 meters, her starboard side visible from above as a dark shape against the sandy bottom. On the anniversary of June 21, 1919, there is no formal ceremony at Scapa Flow. The wrecks do not have the official memorial status of the Royal Oak, which lies in the same anchorage and which receives its annual ceremony of the White Ensign. The German ships are historical curiosities and diving attractions, visited by people who come for the experience of swimming through the ruins of a fleet that destroyed itself in a single morning. They are the physical residue of an argument about who owned them that was never resolved, settled instead by the act of a rear admiral who decided that the question of ownership was less important than the question of dignity, and who gave an order at 10:52 hours on a June morning that ensured the question would never need to be answered. Paragraph 11. Acknowledge, 52 ships went down, and the war that had not quite ended finally did.